That's good. Whereas the rest of my
so the Zoom is like people can join the Zoom, but they also can watch it on YouTube. Is that how it works?
That's right.
Cool. And we don't know who's on the YouTube channel, or someone's probably
they're anonymous. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
That's the point. It's a free for all for people that don't feel like joining.
So we don't do chat via YouTube or anything.
Nah.
Cool.
Hope not. Toby shook his head. That's good.
I have slow mode on. I'll be moderating it, and by the way, the YouTube is live.
Yes,
right now.
Yep.
Yes. Hey YouTube.
Hello, 3 people.
Hey.
I like the idea because when I set up Melbourne CSS in physical space, usually I have like the nice, neatly ordered chairs, and then I'll have like a lounge section, so that you get some comfy chairs for people just to relax in. So I see the YouTube channel as lounge basically. So you're not really actively participating, but you're there. So that's good enough.
It's the lounge room. I haven't actually seen the YouTube channel yet. I should bring it up, although we get terrible feedback if I did.
Well, Zoom's usually pretty good. It depends how you do this, but Zoom's pretty good at only taking the audio that you give it.
And do you find that the audience is mostly people you know from Melbourne, or do you get people tuning in from across Australia now, or even outside Australia?
We haven't done too many of these, of the virtual ones.
Right.
This is 3 or 4.
The second.
This is only our second. And what happened this year? Anything much?
So Charlie's just asked, what is Talk CSS? Please explain what is Talk CSS.
It's Melbourne CSS.
So is that you ran the Singapore one when you were living there, right, Chris?
Yeah, I did.
So that's kind of taken from their branding a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the idea is what we used to do in Singapore is we'd shake it up here and there. We'd have different events, but this is Talk CSS when people talk about CSS. So we potentially in the future at some point will do other stuff. I mean,
like,
I did at one point.
hackathon-y type mentor nights or something like that. Like
exactly. I've intentionally, the model is open, even though people have not seen anything other than this so far in Melbourne.
Yeah, cool.
The plan for me, having resurrected Melbourne CSS, was to do stuff like that this year, but that didn't happen.
I'll let you know if you ever want a hand, and I'll jump on and do something else. But yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who would love to.
Yeah, I mean, we did workshops, we did lots of stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, now
we had our conference. Yeah, I know.
Now that it's online, we can get people from Perth and even Singapore. Like,
yeah. Well, we can do that anyway. Technically, we can just have a combination. I'm never too frightened of such things. But yeah, I mean, I did almost get you to Singapore once.
That's right. I can't. We didn't do that, did we?
I didn't need you.
Fair enough.
I had you as a shortlist. It didn't happen. And if we'd done another one, you would have been there. But
I did. I got there in person, and I gave a talk in Singapore in person once. Was that a Singapore CSS or something else?
You did a conference one, didn't you? JS Conf or something?
No, I went to the conference, but I think I gave a talk at like a pre-event, which I think was a Singapore CSS event, maybe, or was it JS?
Maybe you did. There's Singapore JS that's bigger.
I don't know. All I remember is it was stupid hot, and I didn't wear any shoes, and someone put it on Twitter.
That's the dress code in Singapore.
Yeah. They also had this nice fake grass, so I was like, yeah, I'll experience how that feels.
But it's a laugh in the business area because you see anyone who's wearing a jacket, you know they're a foreigner, and you know that they don't know not to wear a jacket because you're just going to melt. It's bad enough if you have to wear a shirt and everything anyway, but yeah, it's a bad idea.
So how's the YouTube looking? Have we given the folks enough warm-up time now?
We got 4 people at the moment.
What time do you normally kick off? Do you sort of give it a 10 or 15
Yeah,
bit of warm-up discussion?
we're not as rigidly organized as most other meetups, as you'll realize.
All right.
I mean, the Singapore CSS started because I'd been going to a couple of SID CSS when I'd been over in Sydney for web directions. And when I went to Singapore, I went to a SID CSS and I shadowed Fiona and David and asked them lots of annoying questions. And that's how we came up with the model for Singapore CSS.
Yeah, I think that's might be where I first ran into you. Maybe.
It's possible.
Yeah.
You see people at lots of different things. And you see the same people again and again as well.
And you lived in Perth before that as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
And I went and did mix-in many years ago in Perth, but did I...
But that was after I was gone.
You were gone then, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if we'd met at that point or not. Don't know.
Possibly not. I kind of lament that mix-in started after I left Perth because I would have been really involved in that, but...
It was a shame it was just one event, like, and for someone who was like, saw a little bit behind the scenes, as like, because I was speaking there with talking to the organizers beforehand, and that they put so much effort into that, and I'm like a pretty casual person. I was just like, like not that it's not appreciated at all, but I'm just like, it's fine, like just you don't need to do that for me, like every little detail, and like I love them for it. Fantastic people, some of my favorite people, but I do think they burnt themselves out a bit on that one.
Yeah, there's always that risk.
Yeah.
But we certainly don't try too hard for Melbourne
CSS. Yeah. And you don't burn
out. But that said, I mean, the conference we ran in Singapore was stupidly hard work. Yeah. A lot of that is trying to sell things to people in Asia because people in Asia don't like paying money for stuff. So where we might have sold tickets for like 150, 200 here, we were selling them for $25 and we struggled.
Yeah. Well, it's down to the business culture, right? Like here, it's the business usually that pays for employees to go. And
yeah, exactly.
So it would depend on what the business culture is like in the city, the country you're selling in, I guess.
Yeah. My experience of various Asian countries I've worked in and people I know who live in them is the companies just don't pay for stuff. They don't pay for personal development.
Yeah, well, I guess they also don't have as many workers' rights in some places in Asia as well. So,
you've got none in all of them.
So when that's part of the culture, I guess like a tighter budget around those kind of things is like expected as well. I guess I've always found it hard as a freelancer, but like because I've spent a fair bit of my time either doing short contracts or freelancing. And usually that means that nobody's going to pay for you to go to a conference, which is fine. And I can probably afford it now, but like when I was starting out and stuff, or when I was between contracts, it's like it is a big hit for an individual. I often wish that I had a big company to pay for those things.
Yeah. I mean, I've been lucky enough that I've been paid for a long time. But then I wasn't, and I paid for stuff myself for a bit.
Yeah.
But I was lucky enough to kind of
especially when I know the people who put in all the effort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now the best way is to speak.
Well, mind you, that is a lot of work too.
Yes, I know. It's probably not worth the cent of it.
Yeah. Like if you want to talk about like the hours put in, I'm not sure it's economical.
Okay, let's not talk about that anymore.
But I do enjoy it. Like it's always a pain. And today I did a bit of practice and worked on the slides a bit, but like this is still not like, because you sprung this on me like just a few days ago.
Yes.
and it's not the amount of polish that I'd like to put into it. And hopefully,
that's our perfect middle ground for Talk CSS. But part of our way of being is that we want people to realize that they can talk just as well as anyone else. The only reason that you and I are here is because we volunteered to. We're stupid enough to sit in front of a computer and project ourselves. But anyone, if they really want to actually speak at a conference or something, this is a great way to start. But it's very much part of the culture that we try to instill.
And on that, I always like to say, if anyone wants to get into it and they want help with writing a proposal or something like that, I always like to volunteer time. So you're welcome to reach out to me on Twitter.
That's very nice of you. I might start the intro bits.
Go for it.
Because we've given everyone a few minutes. Welcome to Melbourne CSS. Yay, we're back. I don't even know when we'll be back in the flesh. Our next one will probably have to be virtual again. But who knows? I know I'm not allowed to return to my office for the rest of the year. So actually meeting people is going to be something else. We have a code of conduct. Basically, be nice to each other, or be excellent to each other. In fact, to quote verbatim, we do not tolerate any form of harassment or anything along those lines. If you want to be sexist, racist, anything else like that, take it elsewhere. If you don't agree with that, thanks for coming. Goodbye. This is not the right place for anything like that. If you are subject to anything of these things through a Melbourne CSS event, then please get in touch with myself or Ed, who's unfortunately not here tonight, and we will do everything we can to help you out. There's a long version of this code of conduct, which is a open source-ish one, actually, that we've tailored for Melbourne CSS. But you can certainly read the details and ask us questions if you like. But yes, please do be nice. Normally, once upon a time when we did meet in person, we were sponsored by Iris, because that's who hosts us when we do that. So we'll be there again one day. And Culture Amp have been very kind enough to, again, help us in the past, even if not right now, but I still appreciate them. So thank you, Culture Amp. We have a Slack group because, there aren't enough Slack groups in the world. I set this up because there was one in Singapore I used to love, which was Copy.js. And Copy in Singapore is where people meet in person. So I came up with the Australian version of that, which is flat white. There's not much discussion on there at all. So if you like Slack groups where no one says anything, it could be good for you. But it's a place where you can ask stupid questions about why does my code not work, and people will help you out. Usually it's me asking why does my code not work. But that could be you as well. The idea is just to be an open forum for developers asking dev stuff, basically. All right, HTML element of the month. This month we have what did I choose? The figure and fig caption. So I'll awkwardly change my sharing.
If this isn't Sesame Street themed, I'm going to be incredibly disappointed.
Oh, I've let you down. All right, this is, I have cats as a running theme through everything that I present. I have to have at least one cat picture somewhere. So given this is an image, basically I had to have a place kitten to do something with it. So the figure is pretty straightforward. What it does is you wrap it around an image and anything that goes with that, and that is a figure. So instead of giving it a div, instead of trying to float it and do weird stuff that you might do with an image on its own or something, it actually gives it a bit of structure within the DOM. Further to that, we've got the fig caption, which allows you to place a caption on an image. There's not really much else to know about it other than it gives you semantics for nothing, which is really nice. I do have a weird bug. Let's throw that to anyone. Can you tell me why on earth I've got this line in here? Because it doesn't appear anywhere.
Is that weird space you sometimes get with images when they're inline?
I changed it to inline block to see if that was going to make a difference, and it didn't. So I do wonder what on earth.
What if you said figure?
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, there you go.
Yep.
Yeah. Images do that. I used to know why, but I can't remember the explanation off the top of my head.
Yes. It's like the 3-pixel jog for images that's just back.
Yeah, it's when images are inline block. Because I think is inline block the default for images? I think it is.
Yes, they are. I think. I don't know. Everything's still structured these days. I haven't looked at one for a while. And I'm working on a trading platform right now. We don't do pictures much. So that's the fig caption. So next time you're trying to put images in text in particular, so you're placing an image somewhere, think about the figure and the fig caption, because they'll give you free semantics. Alrighty. Next up is our CSS color of the month. There are lots and lots of named CSS colors, and I don't recommend anyone uses them at all, and you should use hex instead. But because we like this for no good reason, we choose one every month and showcase it. So this month we've chosen tomato. So next time you're looking around and thinking, gee, I need a color to fit in somewhere, think of a tomato and choose the color tomato. Mike, you were going to say something about name colors then.
I think name colors are fantastic. Use them everywhere. And also, I think tomato is a solid color. Like that one works really well with blacks and whites, and like it just, I don't know. Every time I reach for like a named color because I'm prototyping something, I use tomato, and then by the end of the process, I'm like, actually, it's tomato now.
It is a good color. I'm used to using corporate colors where everything's set to you in an RGB anyway, so you don't get a choice. So certainly within my narrow world, I've never used one in any real system. They're fun to play with. All right, now I'm going to throw it over to you, Mike. You should be able to see your little screen.
Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Mike. I'm a web developer from Sydney, Australia. That's me there. That's my wombat buddy. That's actually down in Kangaroo Valley. Really cool place, and those are wild wombats. Anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I probably know some of you who are watching. It would be really nice if we could have met in person. It'd be nice to see some old faces and some new faces as well, but we can't because of this stupid pandemic. But you know what? It's okay. It just means that we have to use our imagination. So to help establish the atmosphere tonight, in lieu of an actual venue, I'm going to place descriptive captions on my slides. So I want you to keep an eye out for those. And let me start by setting a vivid scene for you. So it's a warm summer's evening. You're walking to the venue with a gentle, refreshing breeze on the back of your neck. You've arrived early to mingle. Tonight, Melbourne CSS is completely sold out at the Princess Theatre, and the room is full of energy and people chatting. You take a seat near the front, and as I approach the stage, the din of the crowd softens. It feels like the audience takes a collective breath in as I begin my talk on the history of container queries, according to Mike. So for those less familiar with the concept, container queries describe a non-existent but largely hypothesized feature in CSS. And I think that at this point, it's safe to say that container queries are one of the most requested features, if not the most requested feature in CSS ever. And as you can see, my highly scientific data analysis seems to back that up. How do they work? That's a fantastic question, audience members. Well, they don't work yet, and we don't really know what the final syntax might be, but I'll show you an example. By the way, I'm a little bit limited with my bitrate here, and if some of the code samples don't look too sharp, I apologize. Reach out if you want me to provide any of that later. But anyway, container queries conceptually work a little bit like media queries, but the key difference is that rather than responding to the viewport, they respond to the space available inside their container. So let's do a little demo of that. Now I had a video demo on this slide, but I could not seem to get the audio from the desktop to be captured by the capture card and then through Zoom and all of the rest of the stuff that's happening between me and you. So I'm going to do a live demo. And I hate live demos, but we'll see how this goes. Right, so here I have this component over here on the right-hand side. And you can see I can drag this into a container or a layout, which has like these dotted lines here. And it takes up 2 columns. But then if I move that to a space where only 1 column is available, I get 1. If there's more space, I get 4. And a similar sort of technique with these cards here, they can toggle between like a media object type layout or a card layout. A very quick shout out to Phil Walton, who has some more demos of this kind of stuff. And I have pinched a fair bit of the code here to bring you this demo tonight on short notice. But what's really cool about this demo, right, is the layout, the bit with the dotted lines is done with, it's responding to media queries, whereas like none of these components are. And if you have a responsive layout, you can resize that. And when the layout changes, the cards change. So you can see now we've snapped to a single column, and all of those components have gone into whatever mode they need for the space available, whether it's 1, 2, 3 columns or the card or the media object layout. And that's pretty much the container queries demo that I have for you. Now that makes a lot of sense, right? We design components and we design layouts, and our layouts typically have these constraints that usually respond to the viewport, like your layout would normally change relative to the size of the device. But the components should probably be changing according to the constraints of the layout, whether they're used in the main body, in a footer, a header, a sidebar, or anything like that. So you can see from the demo how that kind of works. And my hot take on all of this is that those concepts of layout and presentation are sort of muddled in CSS at the moment. In CSS, there's no clear distinction between presentation styles and layout styles. And this is something that I feel we so often need. And if you've seen any of my other talks or read any of the blog posts that I've written about this stuff, you'll know that the separation of layout and presentation is something that I've advocated for on numerous occasions. And I think it's this lack of separation that is also at the heart of the problem with container queries. And you might be aware that there's some technical challenges with container queries. But before we get into that, like, I really like my web history stuff, and I want to take a look at like why these problems exist. And I believe that some of that is rooted in the history of the web. Now, I probably went back a little bit too far in my research, but like there is literally nobody here to stop me. So you're all going to have to indulge me. In 1945, that's, yes, I did say 1945, a device called a Memex was described but never built. And that's the image on the left-hand side there. The idea was this desk that contains these like rolls of microfilm. And then you have this electronic index where I think you punch in a number, and then it like turns the reels to the appropriate spot, and then like links between different pieces of microfilm using these index numbers. You could like jump from one spot to another, like linking two documents together. So that's kind of cool. It's like this border of like mechanical and electrical kind of engineering, very early days, like not quite sure if you'd call that computing, but we're about to get into the computing era. So in the 60s, in 1965, the term hypertext was coined. And again, this was in a research paper, not actually developed. And then in the later 1960s, some systems were built, but these were still like largely academic systems, sort of linking stuff. And there's a whole lot of research around how to link things in databases. And I'm not even sure we were calling them databases at this stage. But anyway, a lot of hypothetical research happening. It wasn't until the 1980s that commercial applications of hypertext began to arise. And it wasn't actually until 1987 when Apple released something called HyperCard for home computers that this idea really started to take off. And it's important to remember that in 1987, we still didn't have the web. All of these were local database systems or document linking systems. And that's really important context. So by now, the environment was right for the web to emerge. And in 1989, HTML and the web were invented. Now, you probably already know something of this story. The web was created at CERN at a research facility during a collision of particles at high speed. But what's interesting about this story in the context of container queries is that the first version of HTML didn't have any styling or layout whatsoever. It actually largely reflected these document systems that came before it. And for a few years still, it would largely be used for linking pages and documents between CERN and a handful of universities. So the web was beginning to gain popularity slowly outside of these academic circles. And in 1994, CSS was proposed and everybody hated it. By 1995, stylistic attributes like BG color and font face, these are like attributes on the HTML element, definitely all in caps. These started to appear, and again, to sort of contention from many of the original inventors of these platforms. And I'm pretty sure that these were things that like browser vendors sort of like forced into the space. In 1997, CSS became an official standard, and this was only after it had been implemented by Internet Explorer. And in 1999, HTML4 became an official standard. And once again, this was somewhat retrospectively after browsers started implementing these things. So by this point, as you can see, the standards horse has pretty much bolted. And I think this is where the browser wars kicked off. What's interesting here is you can see that CSS emerged under these pressures from early adopters and browser vendors as a solution to something that the early academic gatekeepers didn't necessarily want, or at least not all of them. And I think that the web today is still somewhat, again, constrained by those origins of being a document linking system. And up until this point, as we approach the early 2000s in this story, there still isn't a dedicated layout system for the web. And over the next decade, and some of you, if you've been doing web development as long as I have, as much as I hate to say that, you may remember that the web relied on tables and an unintended side effect of floats, something called a clear fix. We relied on this for over a decade to do layout on the web. And I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge how much of the world's information sharing, e-commerce, and other business would rely on this hack. I find that really, really interesting. So anyway, we're getting close to the birth of the container query idea now. But first, recognizing that there was a problem with no dedicated layout system, in 2009, the Flexbox proposal is put forward, I guess. But don't hold your breath, because it will still be another decade, another half a decade until we can use that. And that's not something that necessarily bodes well for container queries, is it? Okay, so media queries were introduced in 2001, and it's going to be a similar story for media queries. The draft was published in 2001, but it wouldn't become a recommendation until 2012, a W3C recommendation. And once again, this was only after browser vendors started adding support for it. And in this case, TechBro here is kind of right. There were some people who foresaw the coming of the mobile web, but these prophets weren't everyone. And the original idea for media queries might have been somewhat different. The real history of responsive design for me starts in 2010 when Ethan Marcotte wrote his now famous A List Apart article, Responsive Web Design. And this is where that idea exploded. For many people, this was the first time they started hearing about responsive web design. I'd say there's lots of developers who hadn't heard that term at all before. And while many of us were sort of like grappling with new ways of doing things and all these new ideas, there were already some people who were looking ahead to container queries. Perhaps this wasn't the responsive design or the responsive web that they envisioned. So the exact origin of the container query idea is a little cloudy, but it probably emerged in discussions in W3C mailing lists, IRC, and other places where spec people hung out. Personally, I recall discussions from around this time, but locating sources proved more difficult than I expected. And I have to give a big thanks to Zach Leatherman, who documented and archived a lot of sources for the story of the origin of container queries. I found this particular discussion on Twitter between Ian Storm, Taylor, and Paul Irish via that blog post. And what's interesting about this, and again, sorry if you can't read it in the stream, but what I think is interesting is that it's just a discussion about container queries that dates to 2011. And what I find really interesting is it hints to discussions prior to that were being conducted in official channels. So that's one of the earliest kind of references that we have to people talking about it. And a little bit like the academic resistance that there was to CSS initially, there is resistance to the idea of container queries, or there was, probably still is to some extent. And the reason for that is they present some pretty significant challenges for browser developers, and some that require rethinking fundamental approaches of how a browser renders a page. And this is something that I might argue is well overdue given the history of how things evolved. But let's put that problem aside for now. There are a lot of ways that CSS, that a container in CSS can have its dimensions depend on its content, right? So sorry, I missed the bit where I said I just want to describe this problem first. If the content can also respond to the size of the container, you've potentially got problems with a recursive layout. That was the worst introduction to that ever. Anyway, let me try and explain a bit more visually. This is a better description of it. Typically, elements in HTML will resize to fit their content. So imagine that you've got this image here and it's 400 pixels tall. The browser is going to load that and it says, no worries, mate, I'll load this for you and I'll change the height of my container to fit whatever's there. So the container is now 400 pixels tall plus whatever padding exists on that container. Now imagine that you have a container query that defines the following rule, and I hope you can read that, but basically it's just a container query rule with the current proposed syntax that says, when a container is taller than 200 pixels, make the image height 100 pixels. So what would happen? So on the first render, the image will load and this will make the container taller than 200 pixels. It will be that 400 plus padding, which means that the container query kicks in and it will now say, let's make that image 100 pixels tall. But now the container is less than 200 pixels again. So the image is allowed to be full height again. And now we have this unstoppable loop, right? How many times should the browser render this and how should it resolve this issue? And obviously the same thing can happen on the horizontal axis with inline elements. And that's probably the majority use case. But I think this example with an image is really easy for people who aren't familiar with it. So getting back to what I said earlier about the separation of layout and presentation styles, many of these problems with circularity go away if we have these dedicated container elements that respond to the width and height, that don't respond to the width and height of their children. And as I said, our layouts typically respond to viewport constraints. So this could be largely okay. There is an argument that maybe you want them to respond on a single axis and stuff like that. There's a lot more complexity to this, but generally speaking, in theory, the presentational components could respond to these layout containers without being able to affect their width and height. And if that's your argument, some people say, well, we already have something like that, and it's called iframes. So if you just had an involuntary gag reflex, it's not Tailwind, it's iframes, and it's totally understandable. Iframes come with a lot of baggage, both technical and emotional. They are effectively an entire page embedded within another page. And this means that they come with an entire document context, an entire DOM, isolated scripts, isolated styles, rendering, all of that. So this obviously has performance impacts. We can't just use iframes as a solution for container queries. And that's one of the other main technical challenges with container queries. How do we make them performant? And I do think that all of these challenges can be overcome. I'm not exactly sure what the final solution will look like, but I'd be willing to bet that behind the scenes, it's going to be something kind of like an isolated container element that hopefully feels nothing ergonomically like an iframe. Anyway, regardless, I'll keep thinking about layouts and pages as a combination of the layout components and presentational components and isolating these styles accordingly so that I can build, component-driven designs and maybe implement some of these responsive behaviors. So anyway, we'll jump back to the birth of the container query idea now. A huge amount of credit has to go to Andy Hume, who developed this selector queries library in, can you believe it, 2011. So this is just after media queries started to land in browsers. And if this isn't the first example of what is going to soon be called element queries, it's pretty close to it. And without taking anything away from the originality of Andy Hume's idea, it's pretty obvious that this is an idea that the web development community was going to have. Pretty soon we had a whole bunch of techniques for achieving container queries. A lot of people were talking about the idea, but not many people were using it in production because in the early 2010s, JavaScript really wasn't up to the task of watching and responding to resize and mutation events on the DOM. There were still issues of dealing with circularity, and of course they can be dealt with in JavaScript. But the thing is, none of these libraries were really performant. But things were about to change. Between 2013 and 2014, Flexbox would arrive for Firefox and Chrome at least. And it was going to be an absolute game changer. But as well as that, it was also like a fundamental shift in how people thought about layout on the web. For the first time in the history of the web, we had this proper layout system. It even had algorithms for calculating layout based on the content or constraints that could be configured within CSS. So you could kind of like set some parameters for the algorithm and have it sort of work out the exact dimensions. And I remember spending days trying to get my head around this, reading specs, writing blog posts. I even built a Flexbox calculator with JavaScript. And you can probably still find that on the web somewhere, but you probably shouldn't. And I didn't know it at the time, and I don't think many people did, but this was going to be the birth of algorithmic layouts, really. So I'd like to, if this was a live venue, ask how many people have heard of algorithmic layouts. I don't know if that's something you can chuck in the chat if you're on the Zoom. Anyway, I'm not sure where the term algorithmic layouts was coined. It certainly was something that I heard well after I started using algorithmic layouts. Okay, some people haven't heard of them. So it's a term that I think might have been coined by Hayden Pickering, who's like a really good front-end dev, and he writes about a lot of stuff and he speaks. He's bloody good at naming things, so he probably named this. But regardless, him and Andy Bell, another developer, they're both from the UK, packaged up a lot of examples of algorithmic layouts on a website called everylayout.dev. I'm not going to have time to sort of like go into examples of all of these, but essentially what it means is like all of the web is built with, all the layout on the web is built with algorithms, right? There's algorithms everywhere in the browser. It's just algorithms all the way down. So what I think algorithmic layouts is more about is about understanding how those algorithms work and then using them in ways that are perhaps unintended, or at least unintended by the spec writers or by the almost breaking the rules in a way to achieve responsive behaviors that go beyond the scope of media queries. So when you say they were never fun, you mean algorithmic layouts are never fun, Chris? Yeah, they can be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So even though they're difficult to wrap your head around sometimes, they can be really useful, and it's a space that I'm super interested in. And if I've actually had any influence on the web, it's possibly in this area, but probably not. Some early examples include like fluid topography hacks with calc. That's one that I had a hand in. Quantity queries, which is another technique by Hayden Pickering that allows you to style things based on the number of items that exist inside a container. Responsive SVG techniques, I've written a bunch on that, but I also have to give some credit to Estelle Way. I don't know how to say her last name. Anyway, she wrote about this technique called, I think she called it the clown car technique with SVG, which is really just doing responsive images with SVG. So I have to give credit there, even though I feel like I came across that one independently, which happens a lot on the web. There's also dry switching of variables with CSS. That's a blog post, I think originally by Anna Tudor. That gives you some really cool techniques for changing the properties of something based on toggling one property with a custom property. So you toggle one thing in a custom property, you get a whole bunch of other things that can change as a result of that. We also have the Holy Albatross and later the Raven techniques. And I'm going to leave like all of those for you to go and look up yourself. These are all examples of algorithmic layouts, but the one that I want to focus on is one of the earliest examples of a pattern that uses an algorithmic layout. And it's one that probably most people might have seen, but I tell you definitely haven't heard of the person that came across this. Jean Van Hee. And it was one of the only blog posts I've ever seen him write, and it's something called the FlexGrow 9999 hack, or at least that's what I'm calling it. And this is also built on top of a bunch of work by Zoe Mickley-Gillenwater, who in the early days wrote a ton about Flexbox and was teaching all of us how it worked when it was brand new. So I'm going to talk about this example. So effectively, this is an example that allows us to toggle between a card pattern and a media object pattern. So a media object is a pattern on the web, like the right-hand side, where you have like an image and you have a title and you have some text, and you'll see it everywhere. It's like the basis of comments and a whole bunch of other things. And then the card pattern is where you sort of stack those on top of each other. And it's not really easy to do with Flexbox, right? So if you were to sort of say like, I want you to space these things out evenly, they'll grow and shrink with Flexbox. And you can sort of say like, I don't want this one to grow and I don't want this one to grow. But then like when you set the Flexbox to wrap, what happens is the image will just like stay at a fixed size. So there's all these kind of like problems of implementing this pattern. And then Sean eventually figured this one out. So you can see on the left-hand side, we have like a container, which is what we need to target for the hack. And then we have two elements inside there effectively. And the trick to this trick is to give the first item in the container a flex grow value of 1, and to give the second item a flex grow value of something really large, like 9999. And what this means is that when they're right next to each other, the image won't grow any larger than its intrinsic size, or you give it like a flex basis, which is the size that it wants to be. But then if you put wrap on the container, when there's like not enough space for those two components to sit side by side, what will happen is they'll wrap onto their own lines, but because they still both have a grow value, the image is going to grow to fill the rest of the space, as will the paragraph below. So you get like both images full size when collapsed, but when they're side by side, the image will use its intrinsic side, and only the paragraph, only the right-hand side will grow to be as large as it possibly can. So that's a really simple example of an algorithmic layout, and it's actually a more robust one. So if you want to use that, you can go right ahead. And you probably, if you go and have a look at some of those other examples that I mentioned, or any of the examples on every layout, you're probably wondering, are algorithmic layouts the future of layout on the web? Is this going to be what the next generation of the web will be built on? And that's probably a fair enough question, given that we relied on, clear fixes for a decade. But I think it's slightly different. So algorithmic layouts are a collection of different hacks to achieve limited and specific responsive behavior. However, clearfix was like a specific technique, just one technique that kind of became a de facto standard. So I think like the situation's just a little bit different. And I think the web's more mature now. There's a large variety of developers with diverse skills and backgrounds. And it kind of breaks my heart to say it, but I can't see algorithmic layouts pushing the web forward in the way that clearfix did, for the reasons I guess that Chris also touched on there. They're clever as heck, but they require too much specific knowledge of CSS and layout algorithms to implement successfully in large-scale projects, no matter how well they're packaged up. And that's, I think, I'd love to say that was different, but I think we're not that far off having native container queries. And I think that some JavaScript solutions now have a much lighter touch than they used to. So these can be an effective stopgap until we get native container queries. The reality will be it'll probably be a little bit of a mix of both. So in 2018, Resize Observer landed in Chrome. This is something that allows the browser to sort of notify or send an event when an element resizes, and you can listen specifically to one element, because what really happens is as a web page changes size, all of those changes will sort of like cascade down to elements further down the page. So the resize sort of like might be dependent on like 3 steps in a chain. So if you're not listening to that one specific element, you have to sort of like, it just gets throttled. So Resize Observer is a way to avoid like throttling, doing lots of things with JavaScript every time something changes. You just get the one event. And now it's in 2020, so it's taken from 2018 to 2020. We now have support for this in all major browsers. And this means that the JavaScript solutions that I mentioned before are now much more performant and viable. But I also think that very soon these will be replaced with native solutions. So hot off the press, literally weeks prior, or maybe even a week prior to this talk, Chrome announced the intent to prototype container queries. And this is sort of like browser spec people talk for, yeah, well, we'll give that a crack. So basically, they're going to have a go at prototyping, building container queries in Chrome. And this implementation is going to be based on a proposal by Miriam Susan, who deserves a huge amount of credit for pushing this forward and other CSS features forward. And I've put some links up there if you want to sort of like get involved in that discussion. So I probably should have wrapped this up better, but that's really the end of my presentation. That's the history of container queries and where we're up to today. I do think that we'll start to see some native examples of container queries behind flags in the next months, hopefully not much more than that. and I'm hopeful that maybe we can get some intent to ship this within a year or two. Thank you.
Awesome. Massive round of applause, etc. So.
Oh, I forgot to put the caption thing on the end. Oh.
How do we know to applaud if not
Exactly.
being told to?
Exactly. Actually, that's one of the best pieces of advice I ever got about public speaking is let people know when your talk is finished. Because like have you ever been to a meetup where it finishes with "and"? Yeah.
It's like the song where, it's not quite there, but it's another 6 bars that we're just going to tack on the end. It's like, what? The audience is already applauding.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed researching the history of container queries and where we got to today. Did anyone have any questions that I missed?
I'm impressed you mentioned Hypercard because not many people know about it.
Yeah, I actually didn't know about it myself until I saw a talk it was a long time ago now, in Melbourne somewhere, actually. Probably a CSS comp at some point.
But it's I used to list HyperTalk on my CV as languages that I've written and see if anyone ever said anything. Never happened.
I should put my camera back on.
You could do that. It's an interesting point where we are at the moment. We're kind of at the cusp of this, I think. So, going through the history, we've wanted something like this to be right. And what's the State of CSS survey? I think pretty much most of the respondents who are missing things were missing container queries or hoping for. So we're pretty close. I just hope that we get it right. And, things like grid give me hope that the development of CSS things will be good and proper in the future.
Yeah, it's good to have proper native layout features. I mean, one of the difficulties with grid is that I find grid far less open to tricks and hacks than Flexbox, because Flexbox has this algorithm with wrapping that does funny things, whereas grid is like fairly rigid. I don't know. There's a lot more hacks built on top of Flexbox quirks than grid.
But I think that's because grid does what it's meant to do.
Yeah, it might be because grid's that good. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's having grid layouts. That was the thing. Is like that's if you know your grid theory, being able to do that in a browser or something is just like,
it might be worth discussing a little bit, like the 2 axes constraint thing that I mentioned, right? So like I mentioned before that like we already have the possibility to use things like iframes, right? If you've got like a grid-like layout where you know the width and height of the thing, then that's fine, right? You can have a layout and you can have, stuff respond. And if you've only got like a couple of components inside iframes, I'm drinking soda water and it's coming. You
need to go onto the wine.
Sorry?
Sophie's tip is to go straight to the wine.
I should mute myself. What I was going to say is if you've only got a couple, it's not such a big deal. But what happens is like if you want a grid, say, and you want that to respond, to media queries, and then you want the components inside that to adapt naturally. Let's say those components adapt, but then the height of those like stack of cards or whatever it is changes, right? And then suddenly you want that container to respond to the height as well. So it might be that we get something like that, but you get resizing on one axis. So like you can respond to width, but if you're responding, like if your components are responding to changes of the container's width, the container will respond to changes in the component's height. So there's kind of like an inverse relationship between the two, if that makes sense. And that might be one of the compromises. It's a compromise that has been discussed. So that might be one of the ways that it gets implemented. Otherwise, we have to have like all these fixed height layouts, which, would suck.
Makes me think of how iOS layout at least was done. I can't remember what the name for it is, but where you could basically stick components to each other so that they'd adjust according to their relatives. But there was a particular way that iOS used to do it. I think they've changed it, but I can't remember. But that was one of the early things when not everyone had the same size phone, and Apple developers just went, "No, you've killed my world." I mean, it's been an interesting parallel in native web development, seeing that happen, go from fixed to variable very quickly, whereas on the web we've dealt with it for a much longer time, or not. Yeah, I think you have answered questions as we've gone. Thank you very much, Mike. You were called in at almost the last minute, but very close to.
No, that's all right. I mean, I needed to give it later this week anyway, so it's sort of good to have a quick practice. And yeah,
the Germans may not be so forgiving as us.
Yeah, no, they're not. I mean, I was thinking about just removing all the jokes entirely.
You need like actual German jokes, otherwise they may not work.
Yeah. What is a German joke?
Their sense of humour. Do you speak German?
No, I don't. My last name just happens to be German.
Yeah. I was going to actually give you a German introduction just to see if anyone would pay attention, but
I've been to Berlin like a million times. I used to go there like 2 or 3 times a year at least pre-COVID. But yeah, unfortunately, you don't learn any German traveling to Berlin.
Yeah, they usually have a pretty wicked sense of humour, but it's very distinctively German.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't be afraid of dark jokes. Alrighty. We're pretty much at the end anyway. We have a buy me a coffee. So if you love Melbourne CSS and you want us to do stuff like print stickers, which we will do once we have people we can physically give them to, then you can throw some money at us. And I'd like to do some t-shirts at some point as well. Again, this kind of makes us want to do stuff in person. Although there are different ways of doing this, like getting people to do it all online. But I like the physical. You turn up at the thing and you get something. I don't know. How far can we spread the Melbourne CSS brand? But if you do love us and you feel like chipping a few dollars our way, this is a way that you can do that. I'm responsible for another meetup, which is Men Championing Change. And I wouldn't normally cross-promote, but this one I think is really important because it's all about gender equality, which is something that we are terrible at in our industry. And the reason it's Men Championing Change is because there are so many of us that we're the ones that have to do something. It's no good pointing to minorities and saying that you should represent yourself and give yourself a promotion when it's in practice it's us guys who are in charge of too many things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Can I like tell a really short story? I mean, I say it all the time, and I saw an example of this the other day as you do on Twitter, and I'm just so tired of like sort of I guess not guys not saying anything, when they see situations that like it's always on the person who's suffering the the rude, and they may be trolls or bots or whatever, maybe they're better ignored, but like I think even just like diverting the attention away from the people who always have to put up with it, is a small thing you can do,
I mean, you talk about stuff like Twitter, the amount of rubbish that women and just anyone who's a minority has to put up with that Caucasian men do not.
If you're not, volunteer for it sometimes.
Yeah. I think I've been trolled a handful of times ever. And yeah, it's nothing. I've got nothing to complain about ever. So that's that. Feel free to join us and learn about stuff. It's usually aimed at a higher level of like corporate level of people than us developers though. Not that there aren't things that we can do as individuals, but Men Championing Change is usually trying to get like senior people, executives, and anyone else who can actually make a decision involved, which
like
makes
recruiting
it really
and
difficult.
Stuff like that, or
exactly. But the people who can influence the recruiting quite directly in their companies. Not that you can't ask questions yourself and get results that way. I know I certainly have, but yeah, it's still there's a lot to learn. If equality is something that you're interested in, I hope it is. Please join us at some point. Otherwise, this has been Melbourne CSS. Thank you very much, Mike, for talking. Thank you, Xavier, for doing video magic. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, whether in the lounge on YouTube or in the front row here on Zoom. We'll be back next year. And until then, have a great rest of the year. Good night, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. And now YouTube is